In the northern Aegean, where the Macedonian coast curves inward toward a small harbor, there was a town called Stagira. It was not a famous place. It had no great temple, no celebrated agora, no reputation in the wider Greek world for producing men of consequence. What it had was the sea, and the fishing boats drawn up on the shore in the morning, and the particular quality of northern light that falls differently there than it falls in Athens, cooler, more patient somehow, less interested in its own brightness. Into this town, sometime around 384 BCE, a boy was born into the household of a physician named Nicomachus, who served the Macedonian court, and who had spent his professional life learning to look carefully at the body and find in what he saw both pattern and instruction. The boy's name was Aristotle, and the household he was born into was one shaped by that physician's patience, a household in which the world was something to be examined, noted, and understood, rather than merely inhabited. There is something worth holding for a moment in the specific texture of that household. A physician's home in the ancient world was not a sterile or distant place. It was where people came when they were in pain or frightened, where careful hands moved over swollen joints and feverish brows, where the body's interior life, its rhythms, its resistances, its slow betrayals, was a daily subject of attention. Nicomachus would have brought that attention home with him. A child raised in such an atmosphere learns early that the visible world rewards scrutiny, the bloom on a patient's skin, the texture of a wound, the quality of breath. These things carry information, and learning to read them requires a kind of sustained, unhurried looking that does not prejudge what it will find. This was the first school Aristotle ever attended, though no one would have called it that. What it produced in him was a disposition so fundamental to his later thinking that it is difficult to overstate. Where his greatest teacher would eventually argue that the visible world was a shadow of something more real, a pale imitation of forms that existed in a higher register of being, Aristotle would always trust the visible world as the place where knowledge begins and, in important ways, where it ends. This was not a position he arrived at quickly or without difficulty. It was a disposition formed early in the rooms of a physician's house in a small northern town, in the quiet authority of a father who understood the body as something to be carefully observed, not feared, not transcended, but seen. Nicomachus died while Aristotle was still young, and the details of those intervening years are thin. A guardian named Proxenus took responsibility for the boy's education, and at 17, Aristotle made his way south to Athens. The journey, whether taken by sea along the coast or overland through the mountain passes of Macedonia and Thessaly, would have ended with an arrival into a city so much larger and more various than anything Stagira could have shown him that the contrast must have been extraordinary. Athens in the 4th century BCE was not simply a bigger version of what he knew. It was a different order of human settlement, dense with argument, crowded with ideas, saturated with the accumulated intellectual life of a city that had been producing remarkable thinkers for 100 years. The roads between the agora and the harbor were full of people who thought the most important questions were about politics, or beauty, or the nature of the divine. And somewhere to the northeast of the city, on a plot of land sacred to the hero Academos, was the school that Plato had founded, which was called the Academy, and which Aristotle had come to join. He would stay for nearly 20 years. Plato was already in his 60s when Aristotle arrived, established, famous, surrounded by students who had come from across the Greek world to sit with him and follow the long, difficult movements of his thought. The Academy was not a school in any simple administrative sense. It was a community of inquiry, loosely organized, devoted to the pursuit of philosophical and mathematical truth, and presided over by a man whose mind had a quality of upward reach, always moving toward the more general, the more universal, the more fully real. Plato believed the things we see in the world around us, the particular chairs and horses and beautiful faces, are imperfect instances of something more real that lies behind them, a world of forms or ideas that do not change, do not decay, and can be approached not through the senses, but through sustained rational thought. The philosopher's task for Plato was to turn away from the shadows on the wall of the cave and to ascend toward the light that cast them. Aristotle sat somewhere within the grounds of that academy, listening to Plato speak, making careful notes, turning the arguments over in a mind that had been trained by different instincts and different experiences. There is an old story, probably invented, that Plato called him the reader, the one who was always studying, always examining, always working through texts and arguments with a particular quality of close attention. Whether the story is accurate or not, it catches something real. Aristotle at the Academy was not simply an admiring student. He was a thinker in the process of formation, absorbing everything the tradition had to offer, while something in him remained quietly separate, not resistant, not dismissive, but not wholly persuaded either. The forms, those luminous universals that Plato placed beyond the reach of the senses, did not quite satisfy the physician's son from Stagira, for whom the particular bodies in front of him, particular plants, particular animals, particular political arrangements, were always already interesting enough to be the beginning of philosophy, not a mere stepping stone to something beyond. This divergence did not surface as conflict. It is one of the things worth noting about the relationship between these two thinkers, that the disagreement between them, which would eventually become philosophically fundamental, seems to have remained throughout Aristotle's time at the Academy, a quiet internal thing, a series of questions, forming slowly, of objections being carefully weighed and set aside and returned to and weighed again. Plato, by most accounts, found in Aristotle a student of unusual quality. Aristotle, for his part, would later write about his teacher with the careful respect of a man who understood what he had received, even as he noted, honestly and without drama, that in the end, the truth mattered more than any personal loyalty. The phrase has the feeling of something that cost a small amount to say, not a great deal, but a little, and that is about right for the emotional weight of it. Plato died in 347 BCE, after a long life, and after naming as head of the Academy, not Aristotle, but his nephew Speusippus. Aristotle left Athens. There is no evidence that he left badly, or with grievance, or with any particular sense of rupture from the institution he had spent 20 years inside. He traveled first to the court of Hermias, a philosopher king of sorts at Atarneus in Asia Minor, whose niece Pythias he would eventually marry, and then to the island of Lesbos, where he spent time conducting biological research along the coastline and in the lagoons. The biological work he did at Lesbos is among the most remarkable things in the ancient world. Close, careful, entirely original observations of marine life and animal anatomy that would not be seriously surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. The work has the quality of a mind, finally given the space and the subject matter it had always been reaching toward, visible, particular, inexhaustible in its variety. It was during this period, or shortly after, that a request came from the Macedonian court. Philip of Macedon, king and military genius, and father of the boy who would become Alexander the Great, wanted a tutor for his son. The tutor he wanted was Aristotle. What Aristotle thought about this invitation is not recorded. He traveled north to Myesa, a place near the Macedonian capital, where a garden had been set aside for the purpose of this unusual education. The boy Alexander was around 13 years old. Aristotle was in his early 40s, at the height of his intellectual powers, settled now in the distinctive philosophical method that would define all his mature work. What the two of them made of each other in that garden is a question that the historical record answers only in fragments and inference. The formal structure of the lessons seems to have included rhetoric, medicine, and what the sources call philosophy, meaning something broad enough to encompass the study of nature alongside the study of how to reason and how to speak. There is a persistent image, probably partly mythological, of the Iliad lying open between them. Homer as shared text, as instruction in what greatness might cost, and what war actually looks like when someone watches it carefully enough to describe it truly. Whether or not the Iliad was quite so central, the image captures something right about the pedagogical relationship. Aristotle teaching Alexander not only what to think, but how to see, how to attend to the particulars of a situation with enough patience to understand what was actually happening in it. The tension between the two of them, which would eventually estrange them, was not personal in any simple sense. It was philosophical, and it ran very deep. Aristotle's political philosophy was built around the polis, the bounded Greek city-state, small enough for citizens to know each other, complex enough to sustain genuine civic life, governed by laws that reflected a shared conception of human flourishing. For Aristotle, the polis was not merely a convenient administrative arrangement. It was the natural social form for human beings, the environment in which the specifically human capacity for reasoned speech about justice and the good could find its proper expression and exercise. A life fully lived required a community of this kind. The man who had no polis, who stood outside this form of organized civic life, was either less than human or more than human, Aristotle thought, either a beast or a god. Alexander, as he grew, was becoming something that Aristotle's political philosophy had no category for. The bounded polis was not the frame within which Alexander's ambitions could be contained or even understood. What Alexander was making, and what he would spend the rest of his short life assembling through campaigns that carried his armies from Macedonia to the edges of India, was an empire, a political form so different from the polis in its scale, its ambitions, and its internal logic that it essentially belonged to a different philosophical world. The teacher and the student would diverge in a way that was not bitter, exactly, but that was real and eventually complete. Aristotle stayed at Myesa for several years. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE and Alexander took the throne, the educational arrangement at Myesa came naturally to an end. Aristotle traveled once more, back toward Athens, toward the intellectual world he had left when Plato died, toward a city that was still the center of Greek philosophical life, even as the political world around it was being transformed by the campaigns of his former student. He did not return to the academy. He founded his own school. The Lyceum took its name from the grove of Apollo Lykios, in which it was situated, to the east of Athens beyond the city walls. What Aristotle built there, beginning in 335 BCE, was something that had not quite existed before, an institution of philosophical inquiry that combined the practice of theoretical argument with something closer to what a later age would call empirical research. The Lyceum collected political constitutions. Aristotle and his colleagues gathered, cataloged, and studied the constitutional arrangements of 158 Greek city-states, preserving the detail of how different communities had organized their civic lives, what kinds of offices they had created, what kinds of laws they had enacted, what problems they had encountered, and how they had tried to solve them. The Lyceum also housed biological specimens, dissected animals, careful anatomical drawings, organized observations of plant and animal life from across the Greek world and beyond. The covered walkways of the Lyceum in the early morning would have had a particular quality of quiet industry about them. There is an old tradition, probably accurate in its essentials even if not in every detail, that Aristotle walked as he talked, that his lectures were delivered in motion, that he and his colleagues moved among the shelves and specimens while the arguments developed. The word peripatetic, which later attached to the school as a whole, means simply one who walks around. Whether the walking was always philosophical or was sometimes merely habitual, it captures something true about the kind of thinking the Lyceum was built to do. Grounded, mobile, attentive to what was in the room, never quite separated from the physical world it was trying to understand. The philosophical method that Aristotle developed and practiced was the complement of the institution he built. Plato had moved in his philosophy by deductive ascent, beginning from first principles, from what could be established by reason alone, and moving upward toward the most general and most fully real. His philosophy carried the structure of mathematical proof. The particulars of the visible world were for Plato interesting mainly as points of departure, as the shadows on the wall, that might, if followed in the right direction, lead the mind toward the light behind them. Aristotle moved differently. He began with what could be observed, the particular animals in front of him, the particular political arrangements he had collected and studied, the particular human experiences of pleasure, pain, virtue, and friendship that he could observe in the people around him. From these particulars, he moved carefully toward the more general, extracting principles not by deduction from first principles, but by induction from accumulated observation, building toward general claims about what things are and how they work by taking seriously everything that could be seen and noted. The difference between these two methods is not merely technical, it is a difference in where each philosopher thought truth lived. For Plato, truth lived beyond the visible world, in a realm of forms that the senses could not reach and that only sustained rational effort could approach. For Aristotle, truth was in the visible world, waiting to be found by a careful enough observer, not on the surface of things, not immediately legible, but discoverable through patient attention to what was actually there. This difference determined everything, what each man thought philosophy was for, what kind of knowledge it could produce, and what the relationship was between the philosopher's work and the human world in which that work was done. There is a painting made in Rome in the early 16th century by an artist named Raphael that depicts the great thinkers of the ancient world gathered together in a single idealized space of learning. At the center of this scene stand two figures, an old man pointing upward with one hand, and a younger man extending one hand downward, palm open toward the floor. The old man is Plato. The younger man, though he was in fact older than the painting makes him look, is Aristotle. The gestures are not accidental. Raphael was making a philosophical argument in paint, an argument about two ways of understanding where truth is located and what philosophy is for: upward, toward the transcendent, the formal, the universal, the eternally real; downward, with an open hand, toward the earth, the particular, the visible, the world in which human beings actually live their actual lives. The argument the painting makes is not entirely fair to either philosopher. Plato was not simply pointing away from the world, and Aristotle was not simply a philosopher of surfaces, but the image holds something genuine. Between these two orientations, the ascending and the descending, the rationalist and the empiricist, the philosopher of forms and the philosopher of natural kinds, there is a real difference, a genuine divergence in philosophical sensibility that goes all the way down, that manifests in different questions asked, and different methods used, and different visions of what a good human life, well lived, actually looks like. The divergence between Plato and Aristotle is the most consequential divergence in Western philosophy, and it was not a drama or a rupture or a conflict. It was a slow and careful development of a mind formed by different experiences, shaped by different instincts, and finally, after long preparation, ready to work in its own way. The Lyceum would operate for 13 years under Aristotle's direct leadership. He taught there, lectured there, wrote there, producing in those years the dense, compressed, often elliptical texts that have come down to us under his name, and that cover everything from logic to metaphysics, from biology to political philosophy, from the analysis of dramatic tragedy to the question of how to live a good life. These texts were probably not intended for publication in any modern sense. They have the quality of working notes, texts used in teaching, revised over successive years of lecturing, full of cross-references and unresolved questions and passages where the argument pauses, doubles back, and tries a different approach. They are the record of a mind working, not a mind performing. The founding of the Lyceum was not, in any obvious sense, a triumphant moment. Aristotle was returning to Athens in circumstances that were delicate. He was a Macedonian by origin and association, a man connected to the court that was increasingly dominant in Greek political life, arriving in a city where anti-Macedonian feeling was never far below the surface of public life. He was not quite an outsider, but he was not quite at home either. He settled in anyway and began the work. There is something quietly ordinary about this, the settling into independent work after the long preparation, the finding of suitable rooms and suitable colleagues, the beginning of the daily practice that would produce everything that followed. It has the quality not of a grand beginning, but of a continuation of work that had been developing for 20 years, finding at last the institutional form in which it could fully unfold. Whatever the political complications of his position in Athens, the Lyceum gave Aristotle something the Academy had never quite been able to give him, the freedom to build an inquiry shaped entirely by his own philosophical convictions. The collection of constitutions could proceed because he believed that understanding how human communities had actually organized themselves was a necessary part of understanding what political arrangements best served human flourishing. The biological dissections could proceed because he believed that the careful observation of animal life was a necessary part of understanding what life itself was and how it worked. The lectures on ethics could proceed in the direction he wanted them to take, inductive, grounded, attentive to the texture of actual human experience, rather than ascending toward a vision of the good that lay beyond experience altogether. The students who walked with him in the covered walkways of the Lyceum in the early morning were walking with a thinker who had spent his entire adult life preparing to do exactly this. The preparation had included 20 years of philosophical immersion at the Academy, years of biological research at Lesbos, years of teaching the future conqueror of the Persian Empire in a garden at Mieza, years of thinking about the relationship between observation and argument, between the particular and the general, between what can be seen and what can be known. The work that began at the Lyceum was not a departure from all that preparation, it was its destination, quiet, unhurried, finally arrived at after the long approach. The characteristic image of Aristotle at the Lyceum is the philosopher in motion, walking among the shelves and the specimens, talking carefully, working through an argument with the patience of a man who had learned from a physician father that the world rewards slow attention, and who had learned from years at the academy that the most important questions take a long time to answer, and who had learned from his time with Alexander that the gap between a philosophical idea and the world it was meant to illuminate was always larger than it first appeared, and that crossing it required something more than brilliance, something more like the steady accumulation of small, careful acts of looking. What Aristotle was looking for in those walkways, in those lectures, in those dense and elliptical texts, was not a vision of the good that lay beyond the visible world. He was looking for the structure of the good that was already present in the visible world, in the lives of actual people, in the natural development of actual organisms, in the political arrangements that actual communities had built and tested and found wanting and revised and built again. He was looking for what human life, well lived, actually looked like, not in theory, not in the abstract, but in the particular, breathing, historically situated form that any actual human life takes on in a particular time and place, among particular people, shaped by particular habits and particular relationships and particular institutions. That question, what does a human life well lived actually look like, was the question the Lyceum was built to pursue. It was the question that Aristotle had been moving toward since the years in Stagira, in the household of a father who knew how to look. It had taken him the better part of a life to find the right conditions in which to pursue it properly. But by 335 BCE, in the grove to the east of Athens, in the covered walkways among the shelves of constitutions and specimens, the conditions were, at last, in place. The work could begin, and what would emerge from it? Slowly, carefully, over the years of the Lyceum's operation, would be one of the most sustained and searching attempts in the history of human thought to answer a question that every human being, in some form, spends a life asking. Not what the forms look like from a great enough philosophical height, not where reason ultimately points when it has ascended as far as it can go, but what a good life lived on the earth among other people, with actual virtues and actual friendships and actual civic responsibilities, actually consists in, and how to live one. That question had been waiting, as it turns out, all along. It had been waiting in the texture of a physician's household in Stagira. It had been waiting in the long years at the academy, where Aristotle had learned everything he could from Plato, and had found, at the edge of what he had learned, the beginning of his own diverging path. It had been waiting at Lesbos, in the lagoons and tidal pools, where he had watched and noted, and found in the visible life of the world something worthy of the most serious philosophical attention. It had been waiting in the garden at Mieza, where a young king had sat with his teacher over the Iliad, and both of them had been, for the length of that strange education, the same kind of person, curious, attentive, reaching, and now it was here, in Athens, in the Lyceum, in the settled quiet of a mature thinker who had finished preparing and begun, at last, to work. The long preparation was complete. What remained was everything it had been preparing for. The afternoon light in Athens fell at a particular angle in the hours before the evening meal, long and lateral, cutting across the open ground of the Lyceum and catching the dust that the students raised when they settled themselves on the stones or the low benches arranged in the shade. Aristotle tended to lecture at this hour, not because the light was favorable for reading, but because something about the quality of the air in those hours, cooler now, slower, the day's harshest brightness already past, seemed to make the thinking easier. He would begin not by announcing a subject, but by observing one. He had a habit of noticing before he argued, and on the afternoon that the Nicomachean ethics began to take the shape that has come down through the centuries, he seems to have begun not with a definition, not with a proposition to be defended, but with something closer to a simple observation about how human beings move through the world. Everything aims at something, he said, or words that meant that. Every craft, every method of inquiry, every action performed with any intention at all of it is oriented forward towards some outcome that is desired. The archer draws back the bowstring in order to send the arrow to a target. The physician applies the remedy in order to restore health. The general deploys the soldiers in order to secure the city. Even the most apparently aimless action turns out, when examined carefully, to have been directed at something comfort or pleasure or the satisfaction of a habit so old it no longer announces itself as a goal. The students in the late afternoon light would have recognized this easily. It is the kind of observation that seems obvious until someone makes it deliberately, at which point it begins to feel like the beginning of something. What Aristotle was doing in those opening moments was not proving a theorem. He was turning the attention of everyone present toward a feature of human life that they had always been inside of and had never quite looked at directly. That all action is directional, that human beings are creatures who want things, who reach toward things, who are always in some sense in motion toward an end. And once that had been noticed, once the room had settled around it, once it had become not just a statement, but a shared observation, the question that followed was almost inevitable. If everything aims at something, and if some of those some things are themselves aimed at something further, then there must be, somewhere in the structure of human life, an end that does not point beyond itself. Something that is wanted for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. Something that, if you ever arrived at it, would be genuinely enough. The word he reached for was eudaimonia. He set it down quietly, without fanfare, as though it were simply the name of the thing he had been describing all along. And for the students in the lecture hall, it would have carried a particular resonance that the English word happiness, the translation most commonly given now, almost entirely misses. Eudaimonia is built from two parts. The first is eu, which means good or well in the sense of properly, fittingly, in the way a thing should be. The second is daimon, a word that does not map cleanly onto anything in modern English, but which the ancient Greeks understood as a kind of animating spirit, an inner principle of a life, the guiding force that gives a particular existence its characteristic shape. To be eudaimon, in its most literal rendering, was to have a good daimon, to be someone whose animating inner principle was not merely present, but well-ordered, flourishing, in full and proper expression. It named not a feeling that came and went, but a condition of a whole life, seen from the outside as well as felt from within. The distance between that word and the English happiness is worth sitting with for a moment. Happiness, as it tends to be used now, names a state of subjective feeling, an inner warmth, a sense of things going well, a pleasant texture to the day. It can arrive and depart with the weather. It depends heavily on what is currently happening. A piece of good news produces it. A piece of bad news dissolves it. It is, in this sense, something like a barometer reading, a measurement of the current atmospheric pressure of a life, not a structural assessment of the life itself. Eudaimonia was not that. It was not a reading taken on a particular afternoon. It was a verdict almost on the whole of a life considered as a sustained activity, the kind of verdict that can only be delivered, as Aristotle himself noted, looking back over a life that has been lived, not in the middle of it, not on a day when things happen to be going well. A person could feel perfectly happy, warm, well fed, undisturbed, and still not be flourishing in the sense Aristotle meant. The distinction is not obvious, and Aristotle did not pretend it was. He spent most of the Nicomachean Ethics working through its implications, following the threads wherever they led, returning to the central claim from different angles to make sure it held. But the basic shape of the distinction can be felt in a single image that he returns to more than once. Consider a musician of genuine talent and long training. He suggests someone who has spent years developing a real capacity for excellent performance. That musician, sitting quietly in a room without an instrument, still possesses the skill. It has not left them. The years of practice have formed something real inside them, a disposition that is genuinely there, even when not being exercised. But, and this is the point, the skill lying dormant is not the same thing as the skill in use. The music that the musician could make, but is not making, is not the same as the music that fills a room when the playing actually begins. One is a potential, the other is an actuality. And for Aristotle, eudaimonia belonged to the second kind of thing, not the first. He had a careful technical vocabulary for this distinction. The word he used for a dormant disposition, a capacity or skill or excellence that exists but is not currently being exercised, was hexis. The word he used for that same disposition in active expression, fully engaged, doing what it is capable of doing, was energeia. And the claim at the heart of his ethics, stated plainly, is that eudaimonia is energeia, not hexis. It is an activity, not a state. It is something you are doing, or more precisely, something you are being in the active sense of the verb, not something you simply possess. Flourishing is not a treasure stored in a chest somewhere inside a life. It is the living of the life itself, in a particular way, across time. This matters because it changes what kind of thing the good life is, and therefore what kind of thing one should look for when trying to understand it. If flourishing were a state, a condition of being fortunate, well provided for, surrounded by goods, then understanding it would be a matter of identifying those goods and understanding how to acquire and keep them. But if flourishing is an activity, then what matters is not what one possesses, but what one does with what one has been given. The question shifts from what does a good life contain to how does a good life proceed? What kind of ongoing engagement with the world does it constitute? What kind of person does it express? And that is a substantially different question, one that turns not toward external inventory, but toward the quality of a life's activity itself. The activity Aristotle has in mind is not any activity. He is specific about this, and deliberately so. Not all of what human beings do, in his account, rises to the level of excellent human activity. A life organized around eating and drinking and the pleasures of the body is a life that is in some sense pleasant, genuinely pleasant, not dishonestly so, but it is a life organized around pleasures that human beings share with animals, pleasures that do not require the fullest development of what is most distinctly and characteristically human. Aristotle calls this the life of apolesis, the life of enjoyment, and he does not dismiss it with contempt, but he does note its limit. A life spent entirely in the pursuit of pleasant sensation is not a life in which the highest human capacities are being exercised. It is, in a sense, a life running below its own capacity, like an instrument capable of a wide range of expression being used to play only a single note. The capacity that Aristotle keeps returning to, The one that he identifies as most characteristically and most distinctively human is the capacity for reasoned thought, for logos, for the exercise of the soul in accordance with rational principle, not cleverness, not mere calculation, not the ability to find efficient means to desired ends, but something fuller than that, the capacity to perceive situations with accuracy and depth, to deliberate about genuinely important questions, to understand the world and one's place in it with real comprehension, and to act from that understanding in ways that are genuinely good. This is what Aristotle means by the exercise of the soul in accordance with virtue, and it is this activity, sustained across a complete life, that he identifies as eudaimonia. The late afternoon wore on in the Lyceum. The shadows lengthened across the stone. The students shifted on their benches. And Aristotle, working through the argument, would have come eventually to a distinction that gave the whole edifice its particular texture. The distinction between a life organized around pleasure as its highest aim and a life organized around the excellent exercise of rational activity. He was not arguing that pleasure was bad or that the pleasant life was to be avoided. He was arguing something more careful than that a life whose deepest organizing principle is the pursuit of pleasant feeling is a life whose highest human capacities are at best in the service of that lower goal, rather than being exercised for their own sake as ends in themselves. The pleasures of genuine intellectual and moral activity are real pleasures. Aristotle acknowledges this, but they are pleasures that accompany activity, not pleasures that replace it or explain it. They are what excellent activity feels like from the inside, not what it is for. There is a moment in the Nicomachean Ethics where this distinction becomes audible in the specific way Aristotle sets up a comparison. He asks the reader to consider two lives, each of them apparently content. The first is a life organized around ease, comfort, pleasant sensation, freedom from disturbance, the quiet satisfaction of having enough and wanting nothing troubling. The second is a life organized around genuine engagement, the exercise of real capacity, care for things that matter, relationships with people whose characters are genuinely good, work that draws on the best of what a person has to give. Both people, sitting side by side, might report something similar if asked whether they were happy, but Aristotle's quiet insistence is that the contentment of the second life is not the same kind of thing as the contentment of the first, that the reported feeling might be similar, while what underlies it is substantially different, and that the difference matters for how we should think about what a life well lived actually is. The students in the Lyceum would not all have been convinced by this immediately. Some of them would have pressed back. If both people feel the same, why should we say one is flourishing and the other is not? And this is a genuine difficulty, one that the Nicomachean Ethics does not fully dissolve. Aristotle's response, taken at its most careful, is something like this. The question of whether a life is going well is not the same as the question of whether the person living it currently feels good, because the standards for the first question are not exhausted by the standards for the second. A person can be deceived about whether their life is going well, in a way that they cannot be deceived about whether they currently feel pleasant, and more importantly, the full exercise of what is most characteristically human is a good for a human being, whether or not it is always accompanied by the most intense subjective pleasure, in the same way that a musical instrument is being used, well when it is played in a way that draws on its full range, whether or not the player happens to be in a mood that makes the playing feel especially good. This is where the word eudaimonia does its most distinctive work, because it names a condition of the whole life. Seen with something like completeness, it cannot be assessed purely from the inside and purely in the present moment. It requires a longer view, the kind of view that sees the shape of a life from a comfortable distance and can say, taking everything together, whether the life has been the kind of life in which the best of what that person had to offer was actually offered, actually exercised, actually enacted, whether the daimon, the animating inner principle, was not just present, but active, engaged, doing what it was equipped to do. There is something important in that image that bears sitting with the daimon of a life, the guiding spirit, the animating principle, can exist in a diminished state, suppressed or neglected, or simply never fully developed. A person can go through a life without ever bringing their highest capacities into full expression, and such a life might still feel pleasant, might still be reported as happy, might still produce the barometer reading of a comfortable day. What it would not be, in Aristotle's account, is a life in which the full human potential for excellent activity had been realized. And this is not a judgment against the person living it. Aristotle was too careful a thinker to moralize in that way, but a structural observation about what a human life is capable of and what it looks like when those capabilities are given the conditions they need to develop. The evening came slowly to the Lyceum. The lecture continued or ended, and the students dispersed into the cooler air of the approaching night. Aristotle himself would have walked, perhaps, through the covered walkways of the school, the peripatos, the walking path, from which the school's followers eventually took the name peripatetics, and the argument would have continued in his thinking even after the formal lecture had concluded. This is one of the things that comes through most clearly in the texture of the Nicomachean Ethics, that the argument was not performed for an audience, but thought through in good faith, with real attention to the places where it was difficult and the places where it held. The book has the quality of a long, careful conversation with oneself, not finished, exactly, but earnest, pursued with genuine philosophical seriousness. The most distinctive thing about that seriousness, and the thing that gives the ethics its particular quality as a work of philosophy, is the way it refuses to treat eudaimonia as a simple destination. It would have been easier, and in some sense more satisfying as an argument, to identify the good life with a single clear condition, virtue or pleasure, or knowledge, or wealth, or honor. Aristotle considered each of these in turn, and in each case his conclusion was something like, this is a genuine good, and any account of flourishing that left it out entirely would be incomplete. But it is not the whole story, and the mistake is to take one genuine good and elevate it to the status of the only good, replacing the full complexity of a flourishing human life with a single condition that can be pointed at and possessed. Virtue matters enormously. It is, in Aristotle's account, the structural core of eudaimonia, the set of stable dispositions that enable a person to exercise their capacities excellently. But virtue alone, in the abstract, without the activity that expresses it, falls into the condition of the musician who is not playing. It remains as potential, as hexis, rather than rising into the full actuality of energeia. Pleasure matters, genuine pleasure, the pleasure of excellent activity pursued for good reasons, is a real and important part of what a flourishing life feels like, but organized as an end in itself rather than as the natural accompaniment to excellent activity, it loses the connection to what makes it most deeply satisfying. Honor matters. In its way, the recognition of others for one's genuine excellences is something that a fully social being reasonably desires. But honor that is sought for its own sake, detached from the excellences it is supposed to recognize, becomes something hollow, a reflection without an object. What Aristotle offers instead of a single clear destination is something more like a direction. Eudaimonia is not a place where a life arrives. It is the quality of a life that is proceeding in the right direction, at the right speed, with the right capacities exercised, and the right ends in view. It is something that unfolds across time, rather than arriving at a moment. A life cannot be said to be flourishing on the basis of a single excellent action or a single fortunate afternoon. It takes time, the sustained, patient, day-by-day expression of excellent activity, for a life to acquire the quality that the word eudaimonia names. And this is why Aristotle says, borrowing a saying attributed to Solon, that one should call no one happy until they are dead, not because life is grim or uncertain, but because the kind of assessment that eudaimonia requires can only be made of a life as a whole, and a life is not yet a whole while it is still being lived. The listener lying still in the late hours of a quiet night is not being asked to evaluate or audit anything. The argument is not a checklist. The question of what a flourishing life is does not arrive as a demand. It arrives as what it actually is, a question that Aristotle asked in a particular place, at a particular time of day, with the late afternoon light cutting across the stones, and the students settling into their thinking, a question that has been sitting open for a long time, that has been returned to and put down and returned to again, and that has the quality all genuinely hard questions eventually develop when they have been carried long enough. Not a problem that presses for solution, not an urgent matter requiring immediate attention. Something older and more patient than that. A question that was here before this particular evening and will be here when it has passed, asking nothing from anyone, simply present, the way old questions tend to be. Aristotle, walking the Peripatos in the cool of the evening, was not anxious about eudaimonia. This is one of the things that is easy to miss when reading the Ethics quickly, the underlying quality of philosophical ease that runs beneath the careful argument. He was not worried about whether a good life was possible. He thought it clearly was. He was not worried about whether the conditions for flourishing were hopelessly demanding. He thought they were, in fact, quite ordinary, requiring not wealth, not power, not extraordinary fortune, but the steady exercise of genuine human capacities in the direction of what is genuinely good. The demands are real. The virtues require formation over time. Practical wisdom requires long development. Genuine friendship requires genuine attention, but none of this is inaccessible. None of it belongs only to the philosopher or the hero or the spectacularly gifted. What Aristotle believed about eudaimonia at its most unguarded is something like this, that the good life is available to human beings in the full sense of being naturally suited to what human beings are, that the activity which constitutes flourishing is not an alien imposition on human nature, but its own natural completion, the way a healthy tree growing fully in good soil is the natural completion of what an acorn already contains. The argument for this, worked through carefully, requires more than a single afternoon lecture. It requires the whole of the Nicomachean ethics, and beyond that the politics, and beyond that the long patient tradition of philosophical commentary and debate that continued for centuries after Aristotle himself had put the question down. But the basic intuition that a good life is the life in which a human being is actually being fully human, in activity, in engagement, in the genuine exercise of what is most distinctly ours, that intuition can be grasped in a moment, in the way a good observation can be grasped before all its implications have been traced. The students would have walked home in the evening with that intuition moving quietly in their thinking, not fully articulated yet, but already present as a kind of orientation, the sense that the question of how to live was not separate from the question of what a human being most fundamentally is, and that the answer to the second question might, if followed carefully, turn out to be the beginning of an answer to the first, not an answer that ended the inquiry. Aristotle was too honest a philosopher to offer that, but a beginning, a direction, the kind of philosophical foothold that does not resolve the difficulty so much as make it livable, which is often what serious philosophy can actually offer, and which is, in its way, more than enough. The Lyceum in the early evening would have been quieter than it had been at the height of the afternoon. The specimens on the shelves, the scrolls in their cases, the records of constitutions collected from across the Greek world, all of it sitting still in the diminishing light, the long work of patient empirical observation at rest for the night. And somewhere in that stillness, the eguement of the Nicomachean ethics was continuing in the minds of the people who had spent the afternoon with it, being tested against experience, being compared to what they knew of their own lives and the lives of people they admired, being held up against the quiet question of whether it rang true. It did, for many of them, ring true. Not because it was flattering. The account Aristotle offers is demanding in its own way, requiring more than good fortune and pleasant feeling, but because it described something recognizable, the difference between a life that is merely passing by, pleasantly, and a life in which something real is being done, something genuinely engaged with, something that draws on the full depth of what a person has to give. That difference, once noticed, is hard to unfeel, and the Nicomachean ethics is, among other things, the philosophical account of why that felt difference tracks something real, why the sense that one kind of life is more fully a life than another is not merely a subjective preference or a cultural prejudice, but a response to something actual in the structure of human existence and human capacity. This is what the word eudaimonia carries, and why the translation to happiness is not quite right. Not because the Greeks were wiser about this than anyone else, or because the concept belongs only to the ancient world and its particular arrangements, but because the word reaches for something that the ordinary modern conception of happiness does not quite reach, something about the difference between a life that is going well and a life that is genuinely alive, in the active sense, in the sense that matters most when the question is taken seriously. A life in which the animating principle, the daimon, is not dormant but awake, not suppressed but expressed, not potential only but actual, real, ongoing. The dust settled in the Lyceum as the evening deepened. The covered walkways stood empty. The day's thinking had been as good as thinking tends to be, partial, provisional, opened further than it was closed, leaving behind the particular quality of a question genuinely engaged rather than merely posed. And the question itself, what does it mean for a life to go well, truly, and fully, and in the deepest sense, continued, as it always had, as it always does, open and patient in the quiet dark, resting, waiting for nothing, complete in itself as a question, even before any answer has begun to arrive. The sound of the city came faintly through the trees. The evening's first stars were appearing over Athens, and somewhere in the long, slowly developing argument of the Nicomachean ethics, in the patient space between one carefully held distinction and the next, something was at rest, not finished, not resolved, but carried as far as honest thinking could carry it on a single afternoon, set down gently and allowed to breathe in the still air of a spring evening in a city that had not yet decided what to make of this man, and his slow, methodical, endlessly observant way of asking what a life was for. That question does not require urgency. It never has. It can be held gently and without pressure in the particular stillness of a mind that has stopped working for the night. The way a note held too long eventually releases into silence, and the silence carries the shape of the note inside it, and the shape is enough, and the stillness that follows it is its own kind of completion. Aristotle stood before his students and asked them to imagine a musician who had spent years learning only theory. This was not an unusual opening for a lecture at the Lyceum. Aristotle had a habit of beginning with something ordinary, something a craftsman or a farmer might recognize, before turning it slowly to catch the light from a different angle. But the question he was working toward was not really about music. The musician who has only ever studied theory, he suggested, and has never once placed fingers on strings or breath into a reed, has learned a great deal about music without having become, in any meaningful sense, a musician at all. The students would have understood this, and then the room would have gone a little quiet because they could see where it was going. What Aristotle was reaching for in that analogy was a distinction that would run through everything he had to say about how a human being becomes good. Knowledge about virtue and the actual possession of virtue are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. A person can memorize every argument ever made about courage, can follow every logical step from premises to conclusion, can pass any examination you care to devise on the subject of bravery and its opposing vices, and still, when the moment of genuine difficulty arrives, flinch and look away. The arguments will not help them. Something else is needed, something that takes longer and cannot be acquired in any lecture room, and leaves its marks not in the mind alone, but in the hands, the breath, the instinct, the blood. The Greek word Aristotle used was arete. It is often translated as virtue, and that translation will serve well enough as long as the word is understood in its older, fuller sense, not virtue as a kind of pious restraint, not virtue as rule following or the avoidance of pleasure, but virtue as excellence, as the kind of settled quality that makes a thing genuinely good at what it is and does. A knife has its arete, the sharpness and balance that make it cut cleanly. A horse has its arete, the strength and responsiveness that make it worth riding. And a human being has a arete too, not one single excellence, but a family of them, each one a stable and reliable quality of character, rather than a passing mood or a single well-chosen action performed on a lucky afternoon. This is important enough to sit with for a moment. What Aristotle was insisting on was that virtue is not something you do. It is something you are, or more precisely, something you have become, a disposition, a settled way of perceiving situations and feeling about them and moving through them, so reliable and so deeply embedded in the structure of a person that it shapes not only their actions, but their desires and their emotions too. The person who does one courageous thing, but trembles inside and wishes they were elsewhere. The person who gives generously on a particular occasion, but resents every coin. These people are not yet courageous, not yet generous, in the fullest sense. They have performed the action without yet having formed the character. The action is the beginning, it is not the end. Aristotle was working within a tradition he had inherited, and then quietly and completely reorganized. His teacher Plato had understood virtue as a kind of knowledge. To know the good was, on the most rigorous Platonic account, to be drawn toward it, so that moral failure was ultimately a failure of understanding, a case of mistaking apparent goods for real ones. Aristotle looked at this position with the careful, unrushed attention he gave to everything, and found it incomplete. He could see, as anyone who has tried to live carefully can see, that a person may know what the good action is and still fail to do it. The appetites and emotions are not simply errors of reasoning, they have their own force, their own momentum, and they do not yield to argument alone. What they yield to is something altogether more patient and more gradual. They yield to practice. The word Aristotle used for this process was ithismos, habituation. It shares its root with ethos, which is character, and with the word from which the English word ethics descends. The connection is not accidental. Ethics for Aristotle is fundamentally the study of character, not a set of rules to be applied or a table of duties to be consulted, but the investigation of how a human being comes to have the kind of stable, reliable, excellent character from which good action flows naturally and with something close to ease. And character, he held, is formed by habit. We become who we are through what we do, repeatedly, over time, until the doing has remade the doer. He stated this with a directness that is worth holding precisely. We become courageous by practicing courageous actions. We become just by practicing just dealings. We become generous by practicing generosity, and temperate by practicing temperance, and honest by practicing honesty, through the whole long education of a life. Not by reading about courage, not by understanding its definition, by doing it, again and again, in circumstances small enough to manage and large enough to matter, until the action is no longer effortful in the way that foreign things are effortful, until it has settled into the character like water settling into ground, until it is simply part of what this person does, without great deliberation, without resentment, without the slow internal friction of a will that wants something other than what it is doing. A craftsman appeared in many of Aristotle's examples because the analogy was exact in a way that few analogies are. A young potter at the beginning of the work cannot simply know how to center clay. The hands have to learn it. The sensitivity to pressure and resistance, the feel of the clay's response, the adjustment the fingers make before the conscious mind has fully registered that an adjustment was needed. All of this lives in the body, not in any book about pottery. It was acquired through thousands of repetitions, through countless failures that left deposits, through gradual corrections that were eventually absorbed so completely they ceased to feel like corrections and became the natural way of doing things. Years later, the master potter centers the clay without apparent effort, and watching it can look almost effortless, almost like magic, though of course it is neither. It is what patient practice looks like when it has been carried long enough. Aristotle's claim was that character works exactly like this. The person who has practiced generosity long enough reaches a point where generosity is not a decision they have to make, but a natural expression of what they have become. They do not weigh the cost against the benefit. They do not have to overcome reluctance. The generous impulse simply comes first and comes naturally because the long practice of generous action has shaped the desiring part of the soul until its native tendency is toward giving rather than keeping. What began as effort has become nature, or rather, has become a second nature, a cultivated nature, which Aristotle seems to have regarded as in some ways more admirable than the original one, because it was earned. There is something quietly reassuring in this account, in the particular way that things which resist being hurried are reassuring. Character cannot be rushed. There is no shortcut from knowing about virtue to actually having it, but there is also no mystery about how to get there. The path is simply the path of practice, and the practice is available to anyone in any ordinary day. Every small action leaves something behind. Every patient choice, every moment of restraint, when the easier thing would have been indulgence, every act of honesty when a convenient omission was possible, Each of these is not only a good action in itself, but a deposit into the slow formation of a character that will in time find these actions easier, more natural, more genuinely its own. The structure of virtue in Aristotle's account is not simple, and one of the most distinctive things about it is the place it gives to emotion. This is worth dwelling on carefully because it runs against a common picture of what moral goodness requires. In that common picture, the emotionally virtuous person is calm and unmoved, tranquil, where others would feel fear, indifferent, where others would feel desire, detached from the pull of appetite so thoroughly that doing the right. Aristotle looked at this picture and disagreed with it in a way that is both philosophically careful and recognizably human. He drew a distinction between two different kinds of what he called self-control. There is the person who does the right thing, but experiences the pull of the opposite, who is generous, but feels the tug of keeping, who is temperate, but feels the desire for excess, who is honest, but notices the temptation toward easy falsehood. This person acts well. They are better than the person who simply gives in. But Aristotle called them encratic, continent, self-controlled, rather than genuinely virtuous, because the inner division is still there, the friction still present, the right action still requiring the suppression of an impulse that points the other way. The genuinely virtuous person, by contrast, does not experience this friction, not because they feel nothing, but because what they feel has been so thoroughly formed by habituation that their desires and emotions naturally align with what reason identifies as good. The generous person wants to give. The courageous person, in the right circumstances, feels the pull of the noble action. The temperate person finds excess genuinely unappealing, not because they are suppressing appetite, but because their appetitive nature has been formed into a different shape. The word Aristotle used for this full integration, when desire, emotion, and reason move together toward the same good, was something close to what we might call complete virtue, the state in which the soul's different powers are not in tension but in accord. It is the end point toward which habituation tends, the condition that practice is building toward, the reason why the effort of the early stages is worth undertaking. Not because the effort is pleasant, it often is not, but because what it makes possible, on the other side of long practice, is a kind of ease and wholeness that the merely continent person never quite reaches. This bears particularly on one of the most quietly original things Aristotle had to say about courage. Courage, in the account he develops in the Nicomachean Ethics, is not the absence of fear. This distinction mattered to him, and it matters to any careful understanding of what the doctrine of the mean is actually claiming. The person who faces danger without feeling fear is not courageous in Aristotle's sense. They may be rash, or simply constitutionally unusual, in ways that have nothing to do with virtue. Genuine courage involves feeling real fear, feeling it appropriately and in proportion to the genuine danger present, and acting nobly in spite of it, or rather in full acknowledgement of it, because the noble action calls for it. The courageous soldier is afraid. The fear is real. What makes the soldier courageous is not the absence of the fear, but the right relationship to it, the capacity to feel it honestly and let the nobler consideration prevail, not through the suppression of the emotion, but through a character that has been formed to move, well, even when fear is present. This portrait of courage is more demanding than the one that asks only for calm indifference, but it is also more honest, and in its honesty, it opens rather than closes the question of what virtue requires of the inner life. It suggests that the virtuous person is not a person without genuine emotional responses, without fear, without grief, without the pull of desire, but a person whose emotional responses have been shaped so that they are, in the main, appropriate to the situations that call them forth. The virtuous person feels appropriate fear in genuinely dangerous situations, and not more than that. They feel genuine anger at real injustice, and not at small slights or imagined offenses. They feel the full pleasure of good food and good company without being disordered by it. The emotions themselves are not the problem. What matters is the form they take, the objects they are directed at, the proportions in which they arise. This is what the doctrine of the mean is actually about, understood at its deepest. It is not an instruction to feel and do average, middle-of-the-road, compromised things, not a philosophy of lukewarm moderation, of never committing fully to anything. The image Aristotle offers is more precise than that, more demanding than that, more interesting than that. He speaks of the archer finding the center of the target, not of the archer shooting half-heartedly in the general direction of the target. The mean is an excellence, an optimal point, a calibration that requires both skill and judgment to locate and hold. And crucially, this mean is relative, relative to the person, to the situation, to the particular time and set of circumstances in which the action is being required. What counts as the right amount of generosity in one situation is not a fixed number that can be applied everywhere. The right response in a moment of genuine danger is not the same as the right response when the danger is imaginary or minor. The mean is not a formula. It cannot be reduced to a rule. This is precisely where what Aristotle called phronesis enters the account, and where his ethical theory becomes irreducible to any simpler framework. Phronesis is sometimes translated as practical wisdom, and that translation is adequate if practical wisdom is understood as something genuinely distinct from theoretical knowledge, from technical skill, from mere cleverness, from the ability to calculate means to any given end. Practical wisdom is the capacity of an experienced and well-formed person to perceive the morally relevant features of a situation accurately, to feel appropriately about what they perceive, and to identify the right action, not by consulting a table of rules, but by a kind of direct and well-trained perception of what the situation calls for, shaped by years of living and acting carefully and attending honestly to how things went. The person of practical wisdom does not look up the answer. The answer, in a sense, is them. It is in the quality of their perception, their judgment, their capacity to weigh considerations that cannot be reduced to a single scale without distorting them. They bring to each situation the deposit of every situation before it, the accumulated formation of a character that has been taking shape through practice across a long time, and they see what is needed in a way that is partly intuitive, partly reasoned, and entirely inseparable from who they have become. This is why phronesis cannot be taught in the way geometry can be taught. It can be cultivated, nurtured, developed through guidance and through the slow accumulation of experience, but it resists being packaged as a procedure, a method, an algorithm. It is the excellence of the soul that perceives well and moves well in the particular circumstances of a real life, and its formation is the work of years, not of a course of lectures. Aristotle drew a distinction here that is easy to miss, but important to hold. Phronesis is not cleverness. The clever person can identify the most efficient means to any end they happen to have been given. They are useful in the service of any goal, including bad ones. Phronesis, by contrast, requires that the ends themselves be good. It is the wisdom that includes both the capacity to deliberate well about means and the formation of a character that naturally tends toward genuinely good ends, because the two are inseparable in the fully virtuous person. You cannot have practical wisdom while pursuing bad ends, in Aristotle's account, because the misalignment of ends and wisdom would show up immediately in the quality of the perception and the judgment. A person pursuing genuinely bad ends, however clever they are, is not exercising practical wisdom. They are exercising something that resembles it from the outside, but lacks its constitutive relationship to genuine goodness. The architecture of the virtues in Aristotle's account is worth pausing over because it reveals how carefully the different elements of the theory hold each other in place. Moral virtues, courage, generosity, temperance, justice, and the rest are the stable dispositions of character that enable a person to feel and act appropriately across a wide range of human situations. They are formed by habituation, and they concern the desiring and emotional parts of the soul. Intellectual virtues, above all, practical wisdom, are the excellences of the reasoning soul, the capacities that govern the perception and deliberation that moral virtue requires. The two kinds of virtue are not independent. Moral virtue without practical wisdom is incomplete, because without practical wisdom, the person of good character cannot reliably identify the right action in complex or novel situations. And practical wisdom without moral virtue is impossible, because practical wisdom requires the ends to be good, and the goodness of the ends depends on the formation of a good character. Each supports and requires the other. Together they constitute what Aristotle meant by the fully virtuous person. There is a particular image that lodges itself when Aristotle's account of habituation is followed to its conclusion. A child is growing up in a household where certain things are simply done. Honesty is practiced, not announced as a principle, not lectured about, not held up as a trophy virtue to be admired from a distance, but simply done, quietly and consistently, in the ordinary transactions of daily life. When there is money to be returned, it is returned. When something was promised, it is kept. When an error was made, it is acknowledged. The child takes this in, not as a doctrine, but as a way of being in the world, the way in which the people they love and trust inhabit their dealings with others. The practice enters the child not through the front door of argument, but through the constant ambient experience of a life in which honesty is the natural texture of things. Years pass, the child grows, the circumstances of their life change entirely, the household of their childhood is far away. But the honesty is still there, not as a memory of rules, not as an obligation they are carrying out of obligation to the past, but as something closer to a natural tendency, a settled way of moving through situations that involve trust and disclosure and the possibility of convenient omission. The practice of a childhood has become the character of an adult. The deposit that was laid down in small, unnoted repetitions over years has become part of what this person is. And if one were to ask them why they are honest, they might have difficulty answering the question. Not because they have never thought about it, but because honesty is so deeply part of how they move through the world that it does not present itself as a choice requiring justification. It is just what they do. It is, in the fullest sense, who they are. This is what Aristotle was pointing at when he said that moral virtue is acquired through habituation, not a surface-level conditioning, not the mechanical repetition of correct behavior, but the deep, slow, patient formation of a character whose desires, emotions, and perceptions have all been shaped by practice until they naturally tend toward the excellent. The virtues, on this account, are not constraints placed on a self that would rather do otherwise. They are the natural expression of a self that has been formed to be a certain kind of person, and in that formation, something like genuine freedom of character has been achieved. The freedom of a person who moves through the world's situations, not in spite of themselves, but in full accord with themselves, all the soul's powers pointing in the same direction. It is worth noticing how different this is from the picture of moral life as constant struggle. That picture, the picture in which virtue requires the ongoing suppression of a lower nature by a higher will, the daily labor of keeping the appetites in check, the perpetual vigilance of reason against the upwellings of desire, is not Aristotle's picture. He was aware of it, and he took it seriously as a description of a real and admirable form of self-governance, but he did not think it was the highest thing. The highest thing was a character so thoroughly formed that the inner struggle was largely resolved, not by denial, not by suppression, but by the patient education of desire itself, the long work of habituation that gradually brings the emotional and desiring parts of the soul into the kind of natural accord with reason that makes the struggle unnecessary. There is a kind of rest in this vision that is easy to miss when first encountered. The fully virtuous person is not at war with themselves. They are not spending the energy of their life, keeping something down, holding something back, fighting something off. The energy is available for other things, for the full engagement with the activities that constitute a good life, for the attention to the people and the situations that call for it, for the kind of absorbed and generous presence that is only possible for a person who is not preoccupied with their own internal struggle. The formation of character is work, long and patient work, requiring consistency and attention, and the willingness to act well before acting well feels natural. But what it builds over time is a life in which the work has been absorbed, the effort has become second nature, and the freedom of a well-formed character has quietly arrived. Aristotle was not naive about what this required. He knew that not every person grows up in circumstances favorable to the formation of virtue. He knew that the formation of character depends on something more than individual effort, on the quality of the household, the culture of the community, the habits and examples and expectations of the people surrounding a developing person. He was not proposing virtue as a solo project, achievable by pure will from any starting point. The conditions matter, the examples matter, the slow ambient texture of the world in which a person grows matters enormously, and he would say more about this in other places and in other connections. But within the conditions that support it, the formation of character was for Aristotle genuinely possible, a real transformation of the desiring and feeling self, not just the acquisition of a set of behaviors. Late afternoon at the Lyceum would have brought a particular quality of light through the covered walkways, where Aristotle and his colleagues walked and talked and argued. The light was the warm, low light of a day beginning to decline, the kind of light in which it is natural to think about what a day has been made of, what its actions have added up to, whether the small choices and the smaller ones within them have been forming something real and durable. It is easy to imagine Aristotle in this light, not as a monument or an authority, but as a person who had thought very carefully about what it means to live well, and had arrived through that thinking to the patient and uncoercive conviction that the answer was available to anyone willing to undertake the long work of formation, not the dramatic work of a single heroic decision, the quieter, more continuous work of ordinary days, lived carefully and consistently, each one leaving its small deposit. The doctrine of the mean, in this light, is less a theoretical claim about the structure of the virtues than a description of what a well-formed life actually looks like from the inside, a life in which the responses to the world's situations are neither excessive nor deficient, neither overblown nor withered, but calibrated, appropriate, alive to what each moment actually requires, not a lukewarm life, a precise one, a life in which the emotions are real and the reason is real, and they move together, in the best cases without the grinding friction of a soul divided against itself. This calibration is never finished. It is never a problem solved and set aside, but after enough practice, enough honest living, enough of the patient repetition that gradually becomes character, it becomes something a person can inhabit, with something that resembles ease. The image to hold is not grand. It is a craftsman who has practiced their craft for a long time, working now in the quiet morning, the movements in their hands carrying the deposit of years, the judgment natural and unhurried, the quality of attention given freely, because the self is not divided, and the work is genuinely their own. Nothing is being suppressed. Nothing is being forced. The discipline has long since been absorbed into the grain of who they are, and what remains is simply the work, done well, in the particular and unrepeatable moment of this morning. This light, these hands moving in the way that 10,000 repetitions have taught them to move, easily, and with something very close to wholeness. This is what Aristotle meant by the formation of virtue, and why he began with the musician who had never played. The theory is not the point, the playing is the point, the long, patient, ordinary practice that gradually, invisibly, and with complete reliability makes the player. Aristotle stood before his students in the Lyceum and held up for a moment nothing, only the shape of a question. He let the silence after it do some of the work. "What is a knife for?" he asked, and the answer came easily enough, as answers to easy questions do, to cut. And then, "What is a flautist for?" "To play," someone said, "to make music," and the answer still came without much effort, though it required a little more thought than the knife, because playing well involves something that merely cutting does not. It involves a kind of excellence, a standard against which a particular performance can be measured and found wanting or found good. The students shifted. They could feel the third question gathering somewhere behind the first two. And then Aristotle set it down among them, quietly, the way a stone is set into water. "What is a human being for?" The room did not answer quickly. It is the kind of question that resists the speed at which the easier ones were handled. A knife has a function, because someone made it for a purpose, and the purpose preceded the making, and more. A flautist has a function, because a craft exists, and the craft has standards, and the standards were not invented arbitrarily, but grew from what the instrument can do and what the music demands. But a human being arrived in the world before anyone had specified what it was supposed to do there, and the question of its function cannot be answered by pointing to a maker's intention or a craftsman's design. It has to be answered from the inside, from what a human being actually is, from its nature, its capacities, the particular shape of what it can do, and what it tends toward when those capacities are given room. This was the shape of the problem Aristotle was working through in the first book of his lectures on ethics, the problem that comes before everything else, because without some answer to it, the rest of the inquiry has no ground to stand on. He had already established that every art and pursuit and action aims at something it calls good. He had already shown that the things people pursue are arranged in a kind of hierarchy, with some things chosen only as instruments toward other things, and those other things sometimes chosen as instruments toward still other things, until at some point a thing must be reached that is chosen entirely for itself, without remainder, without further destination. That thing, the thing chosen always for itself, and never merely for the sake of something beyond it, he had called eudaimonia, the condition of living well and doing well, the state that gives a human life its particular quality of wholeness. But the question of what eudaimonia actually consists in, what a human being must be doing and being in order to count as flourishing, that question required a prior question. It required the question of the knife and the flautist, and finally the human being. What Aristotle was reaching for had a name in the tradition he had inherited and reshaped. He called it the ergon, the characteristic function, the work proper to a kind of thing. Every kind of thing that has a function has a corresponding excellence, an arete, which is whatever makes it perform that function particularly well. The excellent knife cuts cleanly and does not dull easily and sits well in the hand. The excellent flautist produces from the instrument everything the instrument can produce, shapes the phrase with precision and with feeling, plays in a way that makes the music more itself. The excellence is not separate from the function, it is the function performed at its best. And if this is true, if every kind of thing has a characteristic function and a corresponding excellence, then finding the characteristic function of a human being would reveal what human excellence consists in, and that in turn would reveal what the good life for a human being actually is. Aristotle moved through the question with the patience of someone who has thought about it long enough to know where the easy answers fail. Life, he said, mere biological life, the kind shared with plants. That cannot be the characteristic function of the human being, because plants have it too, and whatever is characteristic of the human being must be something that distinguishes it from things that merely grow and reproduce and die. Sentient life, then, the capacity for perception and desire and movement, but this is shared with animals, and the human being is not merely an animal, however much it is also an animal. The capacity for perception is real and important, but it does not alone constitute what is distinctive. There was one capacity left in the consideration, one form of activity that belongs specifically in defining to the human being among all living things, and Aristotle set it down at the end of the elimination like an answer that was always going to be there: the active exercise of the soul's faculties in accordance with rational principle, rational activity, not the mere possession of reason, not reason sitting dormant in a mind that never uses it, but reason actively at work, engaged with the world, moving through experience toward understanding, deliberating about action, choosing in accordance with what it finds to be genuinely good. The human being is, in its characteristic function, the living thing that thinks and acts in the light of thinking, and the good human life is the life in which this capacity is exercised with excellence, steadily, across the whole of a life, and toward ends that are genuinely worth choosing. The conclusion sounds perhaps simpler than it is. It sounds as though Aristotle were saying that the good life is the intellectual life, that only the philosopher or the scholar fully flourishes, that everyone else falls short. And there is a passage near the end of the Nicomachean Ethics where he does suggest that the life of pure philosophical contemplation is in some sense the highest kind of human life, the one in which the highest human capacity is exercised most completely and continuously. That passage is there, and it carries its own weight, but the architecture of the argument that leads to it is richer and more generous than that conclusion alone might suggest. The rational capacity Aristotle is pointing to is not only the capacity for abstract theoretical thought. It includes practical reason, the capacity to deliberate well about how to live, how to act, how to treat others, how to balance competing goods in the particular complicated circumstances of an actual human life. The virtues, all of them, are exercises of this capacity. Courage is rational in that it responds to genuine danger with appropriately calibrated feeling and action. justice is rational in that it distributes and exchanges in accordance with what is genuinely due. Even friendship, at its best, is rational in that it perceives and responds to the genuine good of another person. The life of practical excellence, the life of the person who acts and feels and chooses well in the ordinary, irreplaceable circumstances of being a human being among others, is also a life in which the human function is being exercised with excellence. Aristotle at his desk in the Lyceum, working through the ergon argument in the careful prose of the lecture notes that became the Nicomachean Ethics, paused often, it seems, over the question of what makes the human being different from every other living thing. The answer he kept returning to was not merely that humans think, other animals think, in their way, but that humans possess logos in a way that changes what thinking is. Logos? The word carries both reason and language, and the two are not finally separable in Aristotle's picture. To reason is to articulate, to set one consideration beside another and say what follows, to hold the past and the possible future together in the present act of deliberation. To speak is to reason aloud, to make thought shareable, to enter the distinctively human space where the common good can be named and pursued together. The human function, in the end, is not a private achievement. It unfolds in language, in community, in the particular texture of a life lived among others, who also possess logos, who can speak and reason and deliberate and judge, and who together constitute the social world within which any individual exercise of the human function takes place and finds its full meaning. But before the social dimension can be fully inhabited, something else needs to be said about the relationship between the human function and the individual soul, because Aristotle's picture is not simply that the human being is the rational animal and therefore must spend its time reasoning in order to flourish. The picture is more intimate than that. It involves the relationship between reason and the other aspects of the soul, desire, emotion, appetite, and the question of whether flourishing requires those aspects to be subdued by reason, governed from above like restless subjects by a watchful king, or whether something more integrated and quieter than governance is possible. Plato had one answer to this question, and it had a certain grandeur. In the Republic and the Phaedrus, the soul appears as something fundamentally divided, three parts with distinct and sometimes competing interests, requiring the firm governance of reason to function well. The famous image is the charioteer and the two horses, one horse noble and responsive, the other base and pulling always toward the ground, toward pleasure, toward the immediate and the appetitive, and the charioteer, reason, holding both reins and forcing the upward movement, straining toward the beautiful and the true. The image is magnificent. It captures something real about the experience of internal conflict, the way desire and judgment can pull in different directions, the effort required to keep the lower impulses in check. And Plato was not wrong about the conflict. It happens. It is recognizable to anyone who has wanted one thing and known that another was better. But Aristotle looked at this picture and found it incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but telling only part of the story, and possibly the less important part, because the virtuous person, the person who has been well raised, well educated, long practiced in right action, does not, in Aristotle's account, experience virtue as the charioteer experiences the difficult horse. Through constant effort, through the management of something that does not want to be managed. The virtuous person, in Aristotle's picture, has desires and emotions that have themselves been shaped by reason through long habituation until they no longer pull against what reason identifies as good, but align with it, move with it, want what reason wants. The courageous person does not merely override fear through an act of will. The courageous person has a relationship to fear that is already different, appropriate, calibrated, oriented toward genuine danger rather than perceived danger, responsive to what actually matters rather than to every uncomfortable sensation. The generous person does not give while secretly wanting to keep. The generous person actually wants to give, finds it natural and pleasant and right, has been giving long enough that generosity has become the texture of their desires, not just the direction of their will. This is the difference in Aristotle's picture between governance and integration. Plato's soul is a managed state, held together by the authority of its highest element over its most troublesome one. Aristotle's mature virtuous soul is something more like a well-ordered household, not one in which the master commands and the servants reluctantly obey, but one in which everyone's work is understood and valued and done willingly, because the good of the household is genuinely shared and genuinely wanted by everyone within it. The difference between these two pictures is not merely psychological. It reflects a different understanding of what virtue is, what it requires, and what it feels like to live it from the inside. In Aristotle's account, the person whose desires still conflict with reason is not yet fully virtuous. That person is continent in the philosophical sense. They do what is right, despite the pull of desires that run the other way. And this is admirable, and it is better than incontinence, but it is not the full achievement. Full virtue is the state in which reason and desire have been brought into alignment through the long practice of acting well, so that the person who is genuinely courageous or genuinely just does not experience their virtue as an effort of suppression, but as an expression of what they most fully are. The virtuous life in this sense is the natural life, not natural in the sense of instinctive or unreflective, but natural in the sense of being the fulfillment of what the human being is tending toward when it develops as it should. That word tending is important in Aristotle's picture of things. It belongs to a way of thinking about living creatures that is both biological and philosophical, concerned with what things are inclined toward by their nature, what destination is already present in their structure, and will be reached if conditions allow. Aristotle studied living things with the focused attention of someone who had grown up in a medical household and spent years dissecting and cataloging the natural world, and what he found, repeatedly, was that living things have an internal orientation toward their own completion. A seed does not know that it is tending toward a plant. A child does not know that the capacities being formed in them are tending toward the life of a mature human being. But the tendency is real, and it is not arbitrary, and it can be understood. The image of the acorn is one that is gathered around Aristotle's thought for centuries, though he expressed the idea in different terms, in terms of form and matter, potential and actuality, the movement from what something is at its beginning toward what it fully is at its end. The acorn contains within its structure the complete principle of the oak it will become if it is planted in good soil, given water and light, not stunted by disease or starved of what it needs. The oak is not something added to the acorn from outside. It is what the acorn already is, in its tendency, in its potential, in the direction toward which its nature is already moving. Cut the acorn open, and there is no oak visible inside it. But the oak is there nonetheless, there in the form the acorn's development will take, there in the shape the growth will follow, if nothing interrupts it. Something analogous holds for the human being in Aristotle's picture. The infant, the child, the adolescent in whom character is still forming. These are human beings in whose structure the fully flourishing human life is already present as a tendency as a potential, as the direction in which their development will move if they are given the right conditions. Right conditions for the human being are not simply physical, not only soil and water and light, though those are needed too. And Aristotle was clear that the good life requires certain external goods, health and sustenance, and safety among them. The right conditions for the human being are also moral and intellectual and social, habituation in good action from childhood, education of the reasoning capacities, life in a community whose laws and customs and shared practices support and sustain the development of virtue. These conditions are not supplements to the human good, they are constitutive of it, part of what makes the full actualization of the human function possible at all. The philosophical term for this way of thinking about things is teleological, from telos, the Greek word for end or completion, or the destination that gives a developmental process its direction. To think teleologically about the human being is to understand the good life not as something imposed on human nature from outside, not as a demand that contradicts what we are, but as the completion of what we are, the full actualization of capacities whose partial incomplete presence in us already points in its direction. This is what Aristotle means when he says that the human good is the active exercise of the soul's faculties in accordance with virtue. He is not prescribing an alien perfection. He is pointing at what is already present in the structure of a human life, when that life is given what it needs to become what it most fully is. The teleological picture has a particular quality of calm about it once it settles. It is not the calm of complacency. Aristotle was not suggesting that development happens automatically or that the conditions for it can be taken for granted. The oak requires good soil. The human being requires good community, good education, good habituation, the right relationships, a life whose external circumstances do not actively obstruct the exercise of its highest capacities. None of these can be assumed, but within a life that has something like these conditions, and Aristotle thought that most human lives, most of the time, have enough of them, the tendency toward flourishing is not something that has to be forced or manufactured against the grain of what we are. It is something already present in the grain, already moving, already inclined toward its own completion, like a plant turning slowly toward the light. There is a quality of recognition in encountering this picture rather than a quality of discovery. It does not feel like being told something that was previously hidden. It feels more like having something named that was already present in experience, the sense that certain activities feel more fully human than others, that certain kinds of engagement leave a particular quality of satisfaction that is different from the satisfaction of having been comfortable or entertained, that there are moments in an ordinary day when something that might be called the human function is being exercised well, and the difference between those moments and others is not just subjective but real. Aristotle was not offering a guarantee. The teleological picture does not promise that every human being will achieve full flourishing, or that the conditions for it are reliably present, or that the tendency toward completion will always reach its destination. The acorn can fail to become an oak, and the reasons for failure are many: the soil too poor, the light too scarce, disease, damage, circumstances that no individual acorn can have done anything to prevent. Aristotle acknowledged, carefully and without illusion, that certain external conditions are necessary for the good life, and that their absence is a real limitation on what any individual life can achieve. The person who is chronically ill, or chronically poor, or isolated from community, or denied the education that would develop the rational capacities, that person faces genuine obstacles to flourishing. that no amount of virtue can simply overcome. The acknowledgement is not cheerful, but it is honest, and honesty was one of the things Aristotle valued in the conduct of philosophical inquiry. Still, within the range of lives that have something like the necessary conditions, and he thought that range was wide, the picture he was drawing was one of a nature already tending toward its own completion, a function already present in the structure of a human being, a destination that does not have to be invented, but only attended to and given room. The virtues are not arbitrary rules. They are the stable dispositions in which the human function is exercised with excellence, the forms of character in which reason and desire have been brought into the alignment that allows a human life to be fully itself. They are, in this sense, natural, not easy, not automatic, but natural in the deeper sense of belonging to what the human being is when it develops as it should. Aristotle, in the late afternoon of a day at the Lyceum, setting aside the notes from a morning lecture on the virtues, might have stepped out into the covered walkways that connected the library and the dissecting rooms, and the open spaces where students gathered to argue and to ask questions. He was not a man who appears to have separated his philosophical inquiry from his physical attention to the world. The same disposition toward careful observation that led him to catalog the constitutions of 250 city-states and to open and examine the bodies of animals he found on the coast, led him to look carefully at human lives and ask what they were tending toward. He was looking at the same kind of thing in both cases, at the natural world, in which living creatures develop according to principles that can be understood, and at the human world, in which lives develop according to principles that are partly the same and partly their own. Because the human being is the living thing that can understand its own development and participate in it deliberately. The question of what a human being is did not settle into a simple answer in the lecture hall or in the walkways of the Lyceum. It is not the kind of question that settles simply, but in Aristotle's account, it settles into a direction. It settles into the recognition that there is a characteristic function, and that the function is the active exercise of rational life in accordance with virtue, and that this function, performed excellently and continuously across a complete life, within the right conditions and relationships, is what it looks and feels like for a human being to be fully what it is. The philosophical term for this, eudaimonia, carries a weight of meaning that no single word in most other languages can quite hold. But the thing it names is not obscure. It is the quality of a life that is actually being lived by a human being who is actually exercising what is most distinctively and most fully human in them in the way that is most appropriate to who they are and what they have been given to work with. The oak does not choose to be an oak. The acorn does not deliberate about soil conditions, but the human being in Aristotle's account is the living thing that can understand its own telos and can choose within limits to give it the conditions it needs. For the rational capacity that defines the human function is also the capacity through which that function can be known and pursued and in some measure secured. This is not a small thing. It is, in Aristotle's picture, among the most important things about what it is to be a human being, that the creature whose flourishing consists in the exercise of reason is also the creature that can reason about its own flourishing, can understand what it is tending toward, and can participate thoughtfully and deliberately in the movement toward its own completion. There is a particular stillness at the end of a good philosophical conclusion, the kind that comes not from having solved every question, but from having found a ground that holds a place from which the remaining questions can be asked without anxiety. Bertbold found something like that, ground in the ergon argument. It did not resolve everything. The question of whether contemplation or practical virtue constitutes the highest human life remains still. Among those who have read him carefully and disagreed with him carefully, the question of whether the teleological picture of human nature can be sustained without importing assumptions he did not always make explicit, that too remains. Philosophy does not resolve its central questions, or it returns to them from new positions, with new instruments, finding the same difficulty waiting and finding, sometimes, that the difficulty has a different shape when approached from a different angle. But the ground the argument provides, the sense that the good life is the life in which what is most fully human is being exercised with excellence, that virtue is not an external demand, but the internal completion of what we already are, with that reason and desire can be brought into alignment through long and patient practice, that the direction of a human life is already present in its structure, if conditions allow it to unfold. This ground has a quality of steadiness that does not depend on every question being closed. It has the steadiness of something that has been observed, rather than merely postulated, argued for from the inside of a life, rather than imposed from outside it. The plant turns toward the light, not by decision, not by effort, by what it is and what it needs, and the quiet, continuous inclination of its nature toward the conditions of its own flourishing. And something in the human being, in Aristotle's careful and patient picture, tends the same way toward the full exercise of the capacities that are most distinctively its own, toward the relationships and the community and the shared life that make that exercise possible and meaningful, toward the completion that is not a destination, arrived at once and left behind, but a quality of continuous activity, sustained across a whole life, in the direction that the life was always already tending. The question rests here for now. The students have gone home. The walkways of the Lyceum are quiet in the long light of a late afternoon. The notes are set aside. The argument has reached, for today, as far as it will go, not to a final answer, but to a stable resting place, a place from which the next question can be asked when the time comes. And the time is not now. Now there is only the quality of the light, and the direction of the turning, and the slow, unhurried movement of a life toward what it most fully is. The lamp had been burning for some time already when the last of the guests arrived. It stood on a low table near the entrance of the room, its flame upright and steady in the still evening air, casting a circle of warm light across the floor and the near edge of the couch where Aristotle had settled himself among the others. There was food on the table, bread and olives, a bowl of something dark and fragrant, and the particular ease that comes into a room when people who have known each other for years sit down together without the formality of occasion. Athens in the evening. The city quieting, the heat of the afternoon finally relenting, the low sound of the street outside becoming gradually less distinct, as though the world beyond the lamplit room were slowly losing definition. It was in moments like this one, among people he trusted, with food shared and wine poured, and the business of the day at a sufficient distance, that Aristotle sometimes found himself thinking most clearly about what a good life actually was. Not in the abstract, not at the lectern with his students arranged before him in the morning light of the Lyceum, taking their notes. Here, in this room, at this table, with these people who had known him long enough to disagree with him without ceremony, and whose company, even in silence, carried a weight and a warmth that no quantity of pleasant solitary hours could quite replicate. He had noticed this about himself. He noticed most things. The noticing was, in some sense, the method. What he had noticed was that the best evenings, the evenings that left something behind, a kind of residue of well-being that lasted into the following day, were not the evenings of the greatest enjoyment, exactly. They were the evenings of the greatest presence, the evenings when conversation had opened out into something real, when someone had said a thing that landed in the room and changed the quality of the air, when laughter had come from the genuine kind of recognition and not the merely social kind. Those evenings were different from pleasant evenings. They were different in a way that mattered philosophically, and the difference was not incidental to his thinking about the good life. It was, in some sense, the center of it. Aristotle had been thinking for years about the nature of friendship, not as a private interest, not as a sentimental attachment to the subject, but because the more carefully he examined the question of what a flourishing human life consisted of, the more clearly it became apparent that friendship was not ornamental to that question. It was structural. A life from which genuine friendship was absent would be missing something that could not be compensated for by any accumulation of other goods, not wealth, not health, not even a well-formed character operating in perfect accordance with reason. The best human life required other people in a specific and irreducible way, and the philosophy of the good life that failed to account for this was a philosophy that had not looked carefully enough at the actual conditions of human flourishing. He had come to this conclusion not by deduction alone, but by observation, which was always his preferred starting point. He had watched friendships. He had thought about the ones he had seen endure across decades, the ones that had dissolved quickly, the ones that had changed in character as circumstances changed. He had noticed the distinctions that mattered and set them down with the patience of someone who understood that a concept only becomes useful when it has been given its proper edges. There were, he had come to believe, 3 kinds of friendship, though the same word covered all of them, and the covering of all 3 by one word was itself philosophically significant. The first kind was built on utility. 2 people found each other useful, and as long as the usefulness persisted, the friendship persisted. Merchants, colleagues, the relationships that sustained themselves on the exchange of practical benefit, and that dissolved, often without drama or grief, when the benefit ceased. These were real friendships in their way. Aristotle did not dismiss them, but they were friendships in the way that a copy of a painting is a painting. The structure is present, the materials are present, but something at the center is different. The second kind was built on pleasure. 2 people delighted in each other's company, found in each other an occasion for wit or beauty or simple good feeling, and enjoyed being together in the way one enjoys a well-made thing. These 2 were real, and the pleasure they generated was not nothing, but pleasure changes. The company that delighted at 20 may feel hollow at 40, not because anything has been lost, but because the pleasure was always the ground of it, and pleasure, being tied to the particular qualities that gave it, shifts as those qualities shift. Friendships of pleasure are young friendships, often, or friendships of a particular season, and Aristotle had nothing against seasons. The third kind was different in a way that took some care to describe. In the third kind of friendship, what each friend loved in the other was not the other's usefulness or the pleasure of their company, though both of those might be present. What each loved was the other person's character, the genuine qualities of the person, the way they lived, the kind of human being they were working to become. This kind of friendship was rarer than the first 2 and slower because it required the kind of mutual knowledge that only time produced. It required having seen the other person under enough different conditions, difficulty, ease, joy, failure, the ordinary pressures of an ordinary life, to know their character as something real and reliable. and it required that the character known be genuinely good, because one cannot fully love what one does, not genuinely admire, and genuine admiration requires something genuinely admirable. These friendships endured. They endured not because the parties had decided to make them endure, but because they were built on something that did not easily change, the stable disposition of a well-formed character, and because each friend's investment in the other ran deep enough to survive the things that dissolved shallower connections. The useful friend became less available. The pleasant friend moved away. The friend of virtue, the friend who had seen your character across years and had found it worth knowing and worth caring for, and whose character you had found the same, was a person who remained present even in absence, whose good was already part of what you wanted for its own sake, not as a means to your own comfort or pleasure, but because their flourishing had become genuinely irreducibly yours to care about. Aristotle had a phrase for this. He would write it down in the years to come, in the long notebooks that would eventually become the Nicomachean Ethics, though on evenings like this one, the writing was still somewhere ahead, and the thinking was still in its more fluid form. The phrase was another self. The virtuous friend was another self, in the sense that what one recognized in them was a quality of soul one recognized in oneself, and that their good had become continuous with one's own good in the way that one's own good was continuous with itself across time. To love a virtuous friend was to love something good. It was, in a real sense, the outward form of the same love that turned inward constituted the well-ordered character's relationship to its own best life. The lamp threw its light across the table. The conversation moved. Someone said something that made several people laugh, and the laughter was the real kind, a response to genuine recognition, not performance. Aristotle held his cup and was quiet for a moment, in the way he sometimes was when thinking had become pleasant enough to be its own reward. He thought, a person alone in a room, possessing every virtue, with every material good at their disposal, living in complete security, with no enemies and no illness and no fear, such a person would still be missing something, not just the pleasant company of other people, something more fundamental than that. They would be missing the condition in which certain capacities of the human soul can only be exercised, the condition in which the virtues of character become not just stable dispositions, but active expressions of a life lived in full relation to others. Without friendship, justice is a word without a context. Without community, generosity is a tendency without an object. Without the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of being known and cared for by someone who knows you well, even the most well-formed inner life has a quality of incompleteness, not because the person has done something wrong, but because the human good was never, at its deepest level, a solitary good. This was not a sentimental claim. Aristotle was not given to sentiment about these matters. It was a philosophical claim, carefully arrived at, and it had a foundation that went all the way down into the account of human nature itself. Human beings were, in the fullest sense of the term, political animals. The Greek word was zoon politikon, the living creature of the polis, and what it named was something specific, not merely that humans tended to form groups, as many animals did. Not merely that they found safety in numbers, or managed their survival more effectively together than apart. Those things were true, but they were true of other animals too, and they did not by themselves explain what was distinctive about the human form of community. What was distinctive was logos, not simply voice, not simply the capacity to signal pleasure and pain, but reasoned speech in the full sense, the capacity to articulate and to hear articulated the ideas of advantage and harm, justice and injustice, the good and its absence. This capacity was what made organized human community not merely a survival strategy, but the proper environment of human flourishing. The polis was the place where logos could be fully exercised in all its dimensions: political, ethical, philosophical, and the person outside of it, by choice or by necessity, was not fully actualizing the capacities that made them human. There was a phrase Aristotle would reach for when he tried to describe the person who lived entirely outside of human community, either so self sufficient as to need no one, or so base as to be incapable of community. Such a person, he would say, was either a god or a beast. The phrase was not meant unkindly, it was meant precisely. The human good was constituted in the middle space, in the form of community that was neither the divine self sufficiency that needed nothing outside itself, nor the merely animal togetherness that could not articulate what it was doing and why. Human flourishing was social flourishing, not as an additional feature, but as a structural requirement of what a human life, fully lived, actually was. In the room, someone had asked a question about justice, as often happened at these dinners, and the conversation had shifted into the philosophical register it sometimes took on in the later part of the evening, when the warmth of the wine and the ease of familiar company made the harder questions feel approachable in a way they did not always feel at the lectern. Aristotle listened for a moment before speaking. He liked to listen first. There was almost always something useful in what other people said, even when what was useful was the way in which their first attempt at an answer had failed to go deep enough. The question of justice was not, he thought, separable from the question of community. One could not be just in isolation, not in the fullest sense, because justice was a quality of dealings, and dealings required others. One could possess a disposition toward justice, a stable inclination to give others what they were owed, to treat people according to their deserts, to maintain the kind of proportional equity that made organized life possible. But the disposition was only the potential of the virtue, not its full exercise. Justice, like all the moral virtues, was actualized in relation. The virtuous character required other people, the way a musical instrument required air, not as a supplement to its excellence, but as the medium through which its excellence could be heard at all. The polis was, in this sense, more than a political arrangement. It was the enabling condition of the human good. The laws of the city were not simply constraints on individual behavior, external impositions that limited what its citizens could do. At their best, they were the expression of a shared understanding of the good life, institutionalized in such a way as to make the formation of good character possible across generations. The young, not yet possessing the practical wisdom to govern their desires reliably, were shaped by the institutions of the city, its practices, its customs, its moral expectations, in the same way that an apprentice was shaped by the workshop they entered before they had acquired the skill to judge for themselves. The city educated, not only in the explicit sense of schools and teachers, but in the deeper sense of an environment whose daily demands and expectations gradually formed the character of those who lived within it. This was why the question of how a city was governed was never, for Aristotle, merely a political question in the narrow sense. It was an ethical question. The kind of people a city produced was inseparable from the kind of institutions the city maintained, the kind of practices it honored, the kind of life it made available to its citizens. A city that valued the accumulation of wealth above all else would produce citizens whose desires ran in that direction and whose conception of the good life was correspondingly narrow. A city that valued the exercise of reason, the cultivation of friendship, the practice of justice in both public and private life. Such a city would produce a different kind of person and a different kind of flourishing, and the difference was not incidental, but constitutive. Aristotle took a piece of bread from the table and broke it without looking, still thinking. The conversation had moved on around him, the others finding their way through the question of justice in the comfortable, unhurried fashion of people who had discussed such things before and expected to discuss them again, and were in no particular hurry to reach a conclusion tonight. There was something important in that, too, in the quality of the philosophical conversation that was pursued not for the sake of winning an argument, but for the sake of the thinking itself, among people who cared about the question and trusted each other enough to follow it wherever it went. Philia, the Greek word that covered both friendship between individuals and the deeper bond of affection that citizens might feel for their shared life together, was a single word carrying a double weight, and Aristotle had never been entirely sure that the double weight was accidental. The love of friends and the love of fellow citizens were not the same thing. The intimacy of the first could not be replicated at the scale of the second, but they shared a structure. In both cases, what was loved was the good of another or others for its own sake, not merely as a means to one's own benefit. In both cases, the love was grounded in some shared recognition of value, some common sense of what mattered and why. In both cases, the flourishing of the other was genuinely part of what one wanted, not an afterthought to one's own flourishing, but woven into it in a way that made the boundary between the two difficult to draw clearly. A city without philia, without some genuine bond of mutual care among its citizens, was a city held together only by self-interest and legal constraint, and a city held together only by self-interest and legal constraint was fragile. It would hold as long as the interests aligned and the constraints were enforced, and it would dissolve when they did not. The city that endured, the city that genuinely enabled human flourishing, was the city in which citizens recognized themselves in each other, not as identical, not as having all the same interests, but as participants in a shared life, whose quality mattered to all of them, whose institutions they cared about, because they understood those institutions as the conditions of their own best lives. The evening was advancing. The lamp had burned lower, and someone had added oil to it at some point, without Aristotle having particularly noticed, so that it burned now with the same steady light it had held when the guests first arrived, warm and still. Outside, the city had grown quiet. The particular quality of late evening Athens, the smell of it, the sound of it softening into the night, came through the open window at intervals, and then settled back into the stillness of the room. Aristotle had thought often about what it meant to come to the end of a day, and to be able to say, in some honest sense, that the day had been good. Not merely pleasant, not merely without pain or difficulty. Good in the fuller sense, the sense in which good named not just a quality of experience, but a quality of activity, a quality of engagement with the things that mattered, conducted in the company of people who mattered, in the ongoing exercise of the capacities that were most fully and distinctly human. Such a day left something behind. It left the particular residue of a life being well used, and the residue accumulated across days and years in the way that anything real accumulates, not in a single dramatic deposit, but in the patient, largely invisible growth of something that had been consistently tended. He had thought often also about the fear of incompleteness, the feeling that a life might reach its end without having been fully what it could have been, that the good might somehow be missed through inattention or circumstance, or the simple ordinary difficulty of seeing clearly what one was doing and why. He had thought about this not with anxiety, but with the kind of attention the question deserved. And what he had come to, over years of returning to it, was something like this. The incompleteness that mattered was not the incompleteness of having failed to accumulate all available goods. The person who had known real friendship, who had exercised their best capacities in work that genuinely demanded them, who had lived in a community they cared about and had contributed something real to its life, who had formed their character slowly and honestly in the way that character was always formed, through repeated action, through the gradual education of desire and emotion, through the long practice of attending to what actually mattered. Such a person was not incomplete, regardless of what they had not possessed or not achieved. The completeness that mattered was a different kind of completeness from the completeness of a list checked off. What mattered was whether the life had been, in its actual living, an active expression of the human capacities at their best. Whether the days had contained the kind of engagement that was genuinely engagement, the kind of relationship that was genuinely relationship, the kind of thinking that was genuinely thinking, rather than the mere occupation of a mind with whatever happened to present itself. Whether the life had been, in short, a life actually being lived, not observed from a distance, not endured, not gotten through, but inhabited with the full attention and the full use of the faculties that made a human life what it distinctively was. The dinner was ending in the way that good dinners end. Slowly, without anyone deciding it was over, the conversation becoming more fragmentary, the pauses between exchanges growing longer and more comfortable, the guests beginning the gradual process of gathering themselves from the ease of the evening back into the shape required for departure. One of the guests said something quietly to the person beside him, something that produced a low murmur of agreement, and then a silence that settled over the room like something warm. Aristotle was still. He had said what he wanted to say this evening, and was content now simply to be present in the room, in the company, in the particular quality of warmth that gathered around a table where people had eaten together and spoken honestly and sat in the comfortable silence of people who did not need to perform anything for each other. Where he thought of the acorn, as he sometimes did, the small hard thing in the palm, so unpromising in its appearance, carrying within the structure of its smallness the complete formal principle of the tree it was already becoming, if given the right conditions. The oak did not decide to become an oak. It did not struggle toward oaken virtue through an act of deliberate will. It grew in the direction its nature pointed, given soil and water and time and the particular quality of light that fell on that piece of ground. And what grew was both the expression of something already present in the seed and the product of everything the environment had provided. The process was not one of self-overcoming, it was one of self-completion, the gradual actualization of what was already there in potential, given the conditions that made actualization possible. Human flourishing was like this, and unlike this, in ways that mattered. Like it, because the good life was not a heroic achievement imposed by willpower on an unwilling nature, but the natural destination of a nature properly nurtured, the expression of what a human being was already tending toward when the conditions were right. Unlike it, because the conditions for human flourishing included the deliberate cultivation of character, the reflective exercise of practical wisdom, the conscious participation in the life of a community one had chosen or had come to take as one's own. The oak did not choose its soil. The human being, at least in some degree, participated in creating the conditions of their own growth, and the participation was itself part of what the flourishing consisted of. Around the table, the guests were saying their goodbyes in the warm, unhurried way of people who expected to see each other again soon and had no need to make the parting into something it was not. Aristotle watched them go, one by one, back out into the night, carrying with them the particular quality of ease that a good evening among genuine friends produced. Not a changed view of the world, exactly. Not a new piece of knowledge, but something subtler and more durable, the renewed sense that the life one was living was connected, in its daily particulars, to something real and worth continuing. He sat for a while after the last guest had gone, in the room with the lamp still burning and the table not yet cleared, the warmth of the evening persisting in the objects of the room, in the cushions still shaped by the people who had sat on them, in the half-empty cups, in the scattered evidence of a meal shared among people who had been genuinely glad of each other's company. Friendship was not, he thought again, a supplement to the good life. It was one of the forms the good life took. The friend who knew one's character and valued it for its own sake was not an ornament to a life already complete in itself. They were a condition of the completion. The evening that had just passed, the conversation, the laughter, the comfortable silence, the particular quality of ease that came from being genuinely known and genuinely cared for, was not a reward for the philosophical work, not a respite from the real business of living. It was part of the real business of living. It was one of the places where the human good was actually located, as concretely and as genuinely as it was located in the exercise of reason, or the practice of virtue, or the long, patient formation of character that took a lifetime to complete. Outside, Athens was quiet. The streets were empty, or nearly so, and the houses along the road held their domestic lights steadily against the dark, each one a small world of warmth and ordinary life, people at rest or at the edge of rest, the day's activity subsiding into the stillness that gathered in the hours after midnight. Aristotle had always found something consoling in the thought of the city at this hour, the particular image of all those individual lives, each one its own small attempt at the good, arranged together in the shared space of the community, their separate lights contributing to something larger that none of them had designed and none of them could fully see from within. The polis was not a single organism with a single good, as some thinkers had suggested. It was an arrangement of distinct lives, each pursuing its own version of the human good in its own particular circumstances, held together by shared institutions and shared practices, and the mutual recognition that the conditions of a good life could not be maintained by any single person or household alone. The city was the form that human flourishing took at the collective level, not because the city was prior to the individual good, but because the individual good was always already embedded in a social form, always already constituted in part by the relationships, institutions, and shared life of the community in which it was lived. The lamp on the table had burned lower again. Its flame was still steady, still warm, still throwing the same circle of light across the floor and the near edges of the furniture. But the oil would not last much longer. Aristotle looked at it for a moment with the particular attention he gave to things when he was too tired to think, but not yet ready to stop. There was something in the image of the lamp burning in the room after the guests had gone that he found quietly right, not as a symbol of anything, not as a philosophical illustration, but simply as a thing in the world that had a quality worth noticing. The warmth persisted after the occasion for it had passed. The light continued, not because anything was demanding it, but because that was what a lamp that had been properly tended did. He thought of the friends who had sat in this room tonight, and of the years of friendship behind them, and of the years ahead, and of the way in which a life conducted in genuine relation to people one genuinely cared about accumulated something across time that had no name exactly, but that was, he thought, among the most solid things a life could contain. Not a possession, not an achievement, something more like a quality of the ground under everything, the settled assurance that the life being lived was connected, in its daily particulars, to other lives that mattered, and that the mattering was mutual and real and not merely assumed. This was what remained, in the end, after the philosophical arguments had been made, and the distinctions drawn, and the treatises written in the long, careful notebooks. This was what the arguments had been trying to name. Not a doctrine, not a system,